By the time she turns 40, her hands no longer look like the hands of a woman. The knuckles are swollen, the fingers are bent from cold mornings spent breaking ice on the water trough. The skin is split, raw, stained with soda and lye and the iron tang of blood from 1,000 small cuts. When she walks into the village on a Sunday, she will tuck those hands deep into the folds of her shawl, because in Victorian Britain, smooth hands were a status symbol, proof that a woman did not work. And the woman in this story works from before the cockerel crows until long after the candles are lit. It is 4 o'clock in the morning. Somewhere in the soft, sleeping counties of England, in a slate-roofed farmhouse in Devon, in a stone cottage tucked into the Yorkshire Dales, in a low, whitewashed dwelling on the Welsh borderlands, a woman is already awake. The fire she banked the night before is a heap of warm grey ash. She kneels and coaxes a flame from it, blowing softly, the way her mother taught her, the way her grandmother taught her mother. The kettle goes on. The day begins. And it will not end for 16 hours. In the 1851 census, 1.5 million men and women were recorded as working in agriculture across Britain. But that number lies. It always lied. Because the women who churned the butter, who gleaned the corn, who suckled the calves and salted the bacon and stitched the shirts by candlelight, they were rarely written down. Their work was assumed. Their labour was invisible. And yet, without it, the entire Victorian countryside would have collapsed in a single season. Today, on this almanac, we are pulling back the curtain on those forgotten lives, on the dairymaids and the farmers' wives, on the gleaners and the bondages, on the women whose names history did not bother to record. If this is the kind of story you want to hear more of, quiet, true stories from the lost rural world, take a moment now to subscribe to The Forgotten Harvest and leave a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. Whether you are listening from a city flat in London or a farmhouse in Ohio, you are welcome here. Now lean in. The fire is lit. The day begins. The land she lives on is not hers. It almost never is. By the middle of the 19th century, the Great Enclosure Acts had finished their long, hungry work, and the open fields and common lands of rural Britain, where her grandmother's grandmother might have grazed a single cow or kept a goose, had been swallowed into the estates of the gentry. Her husband is most likely a tenant. He pays rent to a landlord who lives in a great house she will never enter. Above that landlord stands the squire, above the squire, the parson, and above them all, somewhere very far away, sits a young queen in mourning, whose name the children are taught to bless. She is one of perhaps 1,700 souls in her parish. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone watches everyone. The blacksmith knows when her husband is short on coin. The miller's wife notices if she comes for less flour than the month before. The vicar marks her in the pew. In a Dorset parish in the 1850s, her husband earns 6 shillings a week, a sum so meagre that breakfast for the entire family is a thin porridge of flour, butter and water, and at midday, bread, and on a fortunate day, a small piece of cheese. Supper is bread again, and, if the pig has been killed, a strip of bacon thinner than a child's finger. She bears children. She bears many. By the time she is 25, she may already have 4. By 35, 8. Some will not live past their first winter. The graveyard at the edge of the village holds more small stones than large ones. Now follow her into the working day. Before she has eaten a single bite herself, she has milked the cow. The pail is heavy, full, it weighs more than a small child. And she carries it into the cool, dim dairy, where the slate shelves are scrubbed white as bone. She skims yesterday's cream from the wide pans with a shallow wooden dish, never with her hands, because the warmth of human skin will spoil it. The cream goes into the churn, a tall end-over-end churn that stands about 4 feet high, and she will turn that churn by hand for an hour or more until the soft fat gathers into pale yellow lumps. In summer, When the cream is rich, the butter comes quickly. In winter, the work can take twice as long, and her shoulders will burn for 2 days afterwards. Then there is the laundry. The Victorians called it Blue Monday, named for the cobalt bluing agent dropped into the final rinse to whiten linens that had begun to yellow. But the work was not 1 day, it was 3. On Sunday, she set the worst stained clothes to soak overnight. On Monday, she hauled bucket after bucket of water from the well, every bucket weighing some 40 pounds, heated it in a copper boiler over the fire, and worked the wash in a tall wooden possing tub with a dolly, a long-handled tool that looked like a wooden stool nailed to a broomstick. She rubbed shirts on a fluted board until her knuckles bled. She wrung them through a hand-cranked mangle. She hung them on hedges or pegged them on a line and prayed it did not rain. On Tuesday she ironed with sad irons, the Victorian word sad simply meaning heavy, heated on the stove until they hissed against a damp finger. A single iron weighed perhaps 6 pounds. A woman might lift one 1,000 times in a day. And bread and cheese and the salting of bacon and the curing of hams and the plucking of geese and the stitching of every garment her family wore, because there was no shop, there was no factory dress, there was only a woman with a needle. Hannah Culwick, a real Victorian working woman who kept a diary across decades, wrote of scrubbing floors on her knees until midnight, of carrying coal scuttles up 4 flights of stairs, of going to bed too tired to undress. Hannah laboured in a town. The farm woman did all that. And then she went out into the fields. In the harvest fields, she did not wield the great scythe. That was the man's tool. But she walked behind the men, gathering the cut stalks, binding them into sheaves, stacking the sheaves into stooks. In the counties of Northumberland and Durham, a particular and almost feudal custom held, a male farm labourer was required to provide what was called a bondager, a woman from his own household, available for the farmer's day labour whenever she was wanted. Often this woman was his wife, often his daughter. She earned roughly half of what a man earned for the same hours of work, sometimes less. And custom, not skill, set her wage. Because the Victorian farm woman was not isolated from empire. Her butter sailed on ships to India. Her wool was woven in Bradford mills and carried to Australia. The straw she plaited in the long evenings by the fire in the counties of Buckinghamshire and Bedfordshire became the bonnets that other women tied beneath their chins in Boston and in Bombay. The Royal Commission on Labour of 1893 to 1894 investigated her conditions and did very little about them. The Industrial Revolution rolled past her cottage door, throwing up steam threshers and mechanical reapers and railways that took her sons to the cities and very often did not bring them back. In 1884, the Lever brothers launched Sunlight Soap, the first packaged branded laundry soap in the world. For the farm woman, that small wrapped bar was not a convenience. It was a small revolution. She was clever. She had to be. She kept hens for eggs and sold the eggs at the village market on Saturday for a few pence. She kept a pig in the sty behind the cottage, fed it scraps and whey from the dairy, and at Martinmas, the 11th of November, she helped slaughter it, and that pig fed her family through the winter. Nothing was wasted. The blood went into puddings, the skin was rendered for soap, the bristles were sold to brushmakers. And the gleanings, the small ears of corn left behind in the harvest field, were her ancient right, gathered with her children behind the reapers, and worth, by some economic historians' reckoning, between 5 and 10% of the family's entire yearly income. But there were also the old things, the strange, tender, half-pagan things that the Victorian farm woman carried down from a deeper, older Britain. When a member of the household died, she would walk to the beehives, knock gently on each hive, and tell the bees the news in a low whisper, because the country people believed that bees not told of a death would leave the farm forever. This was called the telling of the bees. When a swarm settled, she beat a tin pan to ring them home. And at harvest's end, The last sheaf of corn standing in the field was cut by the youngest unmarried girl and woven by her mother into a corn dolly. A small, plaited figure, sometimes shaped like a woman, sometimes like a knot, sometimes like a horseshoe, which hung above the hearth all winter, holding within its braided straw the spirit of the field, until ploughing time came again. These were not superstitions to her. They were the rhythm of the year. They were how a woman who could not read kept time with the turning of the world. So when you next stand at your kitchen sink and turn a tap and warm water pours out without thought, remember her. When you next pull a clean shirt from a drawer, remember the hands that for centuries made that small miracle by hand. When you walk past an empty field at evening and the swallows come low across the stubble, remember that some woman, in some other century, walked that very stubble with a basket on her hip, gathering what the men had missed, so that her children would have bread in February. She was not a domestic angel. She was not a feeble creature confined to a parlour. She was the labour rural Britain refused to count, and history almost forgot her name. Almost. If this story has moved you, please share it with someone, a mother, a daughter, a friend, who needs to be reminded that ordinary lives are never ordinary. And tell us in the comments what forgotten craft, what lost trade, what vanished tradition you would like us to bring back to life in a future almanac. We read every comment. We choose our next stories from your voices. Until next time, keep listening to the whispers of the harvest.